Welcome to the saga of the Tudor family, a remarkable family story that involves the English Reformation, the growth of parliamentary power in England, the rise of England as a global power, some of the most famous characters in all of European history, including Henry VIII, he of countless caricatures, and Elizabeth I, about whom I have an endless fascination and crush. The story begins with this guy, King Henry VII, or before he gets crowned, simple Henry Tudor. Henry, as you may recall from the earlier discussions of the new monarchs, Henry had been on the appeared to be losing side of the English War of the Roses. In the War of the Roses, you remember the House of Lancaster fought the House of York, and it appeared that the House of York under Richard III had won. And that the Lancasterians had been driven from the island, and a Yorkist dynasty had been established under Richard. Henry had fled the defeat and had spent many years living in France as a essentially irrelevant exile. He was not a particularly distinguished part of the House of Lancaster, but he had an arguable distant claim to the throne. He crosses over the English Channel with a small army, having been assisted and encouraged by France, always looking to cause trouble for England. And in the long shot of long shots, Henry Tudor wins. He overthrows the strong and capable Richard III, mostly because Richard III's nobles don't like Richard's growing power and centralization, so they betray Richard. They side with Henry Tudor in a critical battle, and Richard III is killed. Henry then is crowned King Henry VII, and he begins the Tudor dynasty. Henry is an effective new monarch, if not a terribly loved man. He is not a guy of any great personal charm. He doesn't have an appealing personality. He's a miser. He collects his money and keeps it very close to home, so he can't really buy friends. And his reign is rather dour. But again, effective. He's one of these new monarchs. He is breaking down English noble power. He's enhancing English royal power, and he's building up the treasury, getting England's finances in order. Always a critical thing for a new monarch to do. King Henry has two sons. Arthur, Prince of Wales, is the older son. In England, the heir, the prince who is in line to become the next king, is always the Prince of Wales. So currently, Prince Charles in England, he is Prince of Wales. And has been for, it seems like, forever. Arthur is the older son, is getting trained to be the king, and is the Prince of Wales. He has a younger brother, Henry, who is frankly more vital and more charming and more energetic than his older brother, and a little irresponsible. And nobody expects that he's ever going to be king, because that's going to be Arthur's job. Arthur is when he's just a boy, a little boy, he is betrothed or engaged to Catherine of Aragon. Catherine is a Spanish princess. She is the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. Yes, that Ferdinand, that Isabella. Catherine is their daughter. She is pretty. She is smart. She has been very carefully trained by her very formidable mother to be, one, a very devout Catholic, and two, a very good companion to a king. She has been trained to be the partner and consort to a ruler. And so she's an excellent marriage match. She and Arthur are married when they are teenagers. They have a brief time together. The marriage may or may not have been consummated. But then Arthur dies. not an entirely unusual thing in the time. He'd always been a little sickly. He dies, and young Catherine is a young widow in Spain. In England, somewhat isolated and adrift, and people are sort of at ends. What do we do with her, and what do we do of this marriage, which of course had all been about a political alliance between Spain and England? Henry VII, in his typical practical, unromantic fashion, says, well, no problem, I have another son, so widow Catherine can just marry Henry. And so the two teenagers are married, and Henry, somewhat to his surprise, goes from being the irresponsible, if charming younger brother, to married and King Henry VIII. Probably the most famous king in all of English history. Young Henry is a very appealing man. He is a quintessential Renaissance man. He is a wonderful dancer. He's handsome. He's strong. He's a great rider. He's clever. He's educated. He can read and write. And he's really a very impressive fellow. And after the dour reign of his father, Henry VII, Henry VIII is sort of like the new, young, glam king, and everyone's very excited about him and is really looking forward to his reign, and it's going to be great. And Henry loves being king. He loves being the center of attention. Anyway, he was a huge personality, a large man. He was the kind of guy who would have been the center of attention anyway, but you make him the king, and he's just unbelievably dominant. So young Henry becomes king. He begins spreading around that money that his father so carefully gathered up, and he goes to work being king. He is joined in this by Catherine of Aragon. And Catherine really is an excellent queen because, again, well trained by her mother, completely devoted to her husband, completely steadfast in her faith, admired really by almost everybody, and is devoted to supporting her husband in every possible way. So Henry gets to work being king. And of course, one of the things that you must do as a king is have an heir. The problems of the War of the Roses were in part about not having obvious heirs or clear heirs to the throne. Who is going to be the king after you? It's essential for a king, in order to preserve his power, to have an heir who is prepared to step in. Henry, as you no doubt know, did not have good luck with children and heirs. Here's a list of his children. Everyone up to 1518, as up to the red line, is a child of Catherine and Henry. And bless her heart, Catherine during the 1510s there was banging them out, right? They just had very, very bad luck with who these children were and with their survival. 4 miscarriages or stillbirths or infant deaths. Only one of Catherine's 6 children survives. Now, this isn't that unusual. Childbirth was a very dicey thing in this era. 1 in 6 is especially bad luck. But the only child of Catherine to survive infancy is Mary. Mary will grow up to be Queen Mary of England, also known as Bloody Mary. We'll see her soon. The next children we will get to. Oh yes, we will get to them. So Henry, of course, famously goes through multiple wives. As it becomes more and more apparent that Catherine is not going to have a male heir, Henry begins to look elsewhere. And this is really not fair. I mean, Catherine has done everything that you could possibly expect of a wife, other than have a male child, which is really obviously not her fault, although, of course, Henry doesn't see it that way. Also, you know, Catherine, the young, pretty Spanish princess, has now grown into a middle-aged woman who has gone through 6 pregnancies and births. She's kind of getting frumpy and dowdy and not as cute anymore. And although she's still completely devoted to Henry, although she's still a model queen and support, Henry doesn't have his heir, and he doesn't have a cute wife, and Henry, of course, is a deeply, deeply self-centered man. So Henry begins to look elsewhere. How will he find an heir? How will he find the companionship, shall we say, which is so important to him? He meets one of the queen's ladies-in-waiting, sort of a glorified noble maid. And her name, of course, is Anne Boleyn, one of the most famous women in English history. Anne was clever, smart woman. She was not typically described as beautiful, but as striking. She had presence. She was not necessarily the most beautiful woman in the room. She was the woman that everyone noticed, and everyone talked about her long, graceful neck and her very, very bright but dark eyes. She didn't miss anything, and she certainly did not miss Henry. Henry becomes infatuated with the striking Anne, who seems to be so many things that middle-aged, dumpy Catherine is not anymore. And so Henry begins a full court press on young Anne. Anne, who had seen her sister used and then discarded as one of the king's mistresses, Anne does something shocking and something from which we can all take a lesson. Anne says something to the king that he has never heard before. Anne says no. And Henry finds this baffling, but strangely attractive also. Anne says, "Oh, of course, Your Majesty, I love you. How could I not? You are handsome and powerful and strong, and you're the king. I am infatuated with you, but you're married. So I can't sleep with you. I want to, I just can't." Henry is enthralled by this. This is a guy who has probably never heard no in his life. There's never been anything he's wanted that he hasn't been able to get. And here is this woman who is telling him no. And this only inflames him all the more. So Henry is confronted with this dilemma. How can he acquire Anne? He's convinced that Anne is his soulmate. He is entranced by her wit, her edginess. Anne is one of these people who does not suffer fools gladly. If she thinks you're an idiot, she'll tell you you're an idiot. If she thinks the king's making a mistake, she'll tell him he's making a mistake. He's not used to this. He thinks it's kind of cool. And so he's desperate. He's desperate to get with Anne. It takes years. And of course, he tries multiple paths. He would like first to get a divorce from poor Catherine. Now divorce is against church rule. There is no divorce, but there is the possibility of annulment. Annulment is sort of like a super secret special divorce where the church says the marriage never happened. It's not that the marriage happened and we're getting rid of it. It never happened at all. And the only way to get an annulment is if the Pope gives you the special order that says this marriage has been annulled. Now, this is not normally a problem. Popes are usually happy to give kings annulments. That's the kind of relationship popes and kings have. But there's a problem here. Catherine is the aunt of the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V. So he's family. She's family. And as you may remember, Charles had invaded Italy, sacked Rome, and essentially had the Pope under his control. Not exactly a hostage, but definitely subject to Charles's strong influence. So Charles is left, makes it clear to the Pope that he should not be granting an annulment that would be an insult to his family, and by the way, something that his potential enemy Henry wants. So Henry is blocked on this path. He can't get the annulment that he would normally expect to be able to get, and so there's this sort of game, this staring contest, this obscure game of chicken between the Pope and Henry keeps sort of upping the ante and saying, look, if you don't give me what I want, I'm going to do something really drastic. You're not going to like it. I'll withdraw from the church. And the Pope says, oh, don't do that. Please don't do that. You don't have to do that. And the Pope is willing to do anything he can for Henry except give him the annulment which he needs. So it drags on for several years. The whole time, Anne is becoming more and more frustrated. She's really wants to be queen. She really wants to marry Henry. And so she's putting a lot of pressure on him and reminding him of all that he stands to gain if he can just make this little thing happen. Poor Catherine is being treated like complete dirt. She's being humiliated. She's being sent out of the court. She's essentially sent into exile in a cold, drafty, wet castle with her young daughter Mary. Remember, Mary, the legitimate daughter of Henry VIII. And Henry is treating her like garbage. He refuses to see her, refuses to answer her letters. He behaves like a complete heel. Eventually, Henry loses his patience. He tiptoes up to and then eventually declares that the King of England is the head of the Church of England, essentially replacing the Pope with himself. And here is a medallion of Henry's famous profile, proclaiming him not king, but head of the Church of England. So this is Henry presenting himself as a religious figure, Henry instead of the Pope. And so this is the creation of the Church of England, or the Anglican Church, and it is the beginning of a new kind of Protestantism. In the beginning, as we discussed, the Church of England is basically just like the Catholic Church. It's the Roman Catholic Church, but without the Pope. It's like Catholicism light. The funny thing, the ironic thing, if you will, is that Henry was, prior to all this issue with Anne, had no sympathy for the Protestants. When Martin Luther was doing his thing and causing all this trouble, Henry had said some very bad things about Luther. He had no attraction to Luther. He liked the kind of hierarchical nature of the Catholic Church. He liked the idea of using the church to centralize his power, just like Ferdinand and Isabella had done, just like Charles V wanted to do in the Holy Roman Empire. He was trying to follow the playbook here. So he was not by nature a religious reformer. But now things are different. And so he is now the head of the church, and he in his supreme arrogance begins to think of himself as a great religious leader, as a theological thinker. And so he begins tinkering with doctrine, and it all is going to become rather a muddle. So Anne and Henry are finally married. The marriage is consummated. Frankly, the marriage is consummated before they actually technically get married. When the writing was on the wall about the Church of England, Anne finally gives in. And even before they are married, Anne is pregnant. And she has a daughter who is remarkable. She has the daughter who is Elizabeth. This is a picture of Elizabeth when she's about 13 years old. She was not actually the queen at this point. She was just Elizabeth, daughter of Anne and Henry. Elizabeth in many ways is a combination of the best traits of her two parents. She has her mother's vivacity and cleverness. She has her father's strength of character and charisma, and we will hear much more about her later. Unfortunately for Anne, she is not able to produce the male heir that Henry so desperately desires and needs. Furthermore, the things that Henry found so charming and appealing in a girlfriend, the edginess, the wit, the ability to say no to him, now that they're married, she's kind of a nag. He sees her as a pain in the neck. She's not so fun anymore. She's not so charming anymore. And she keeps telling him no and telling him things that he doesn't want to hear. And he just plain gets tired of it. If she'd had a son, everything would have been different, but she doesn't. So Henry gets sick of her. And he meets one of her ladies in waiting, a young woman named Jane Seymour. There's a certain karmic payback here, right? Anne had been the lady-in-waiting servant to Catherine of Aragon, and you might say fairly had sort of betrayed Catherine by seducing her husband and causing him to get divorced. Well, the same thing happens now. Jane Seymour is Anne's lady-in-waiting. Henry meets her, thinks she's really attractive, and Jane is everything that Anne is not. Where Anne is edgy and challenging, Jane is pliant and reassuring and would never say no to Henry, would never tell him that he's wrong. And, oh, you're so right, your majesty, you're so strong, of course, whatever you want. And so Henry finds this very appealing after the disappointments of Anne. And so Anne is tragically sent off to the Tower of London. Henry wants her to agree to a divorce. She won't. She is accused of horrific things. They make up the most awful accusations against her, including that she is having an adulterous affair with her own brother. None of it's true. It doesn't matter. Henry's completely captivated court and judiciary condemn Anne. She is sent off to the Tower of London, the famous Tower of London, the Bloody Tower, which you can go and see to this day, where she was held awaiting execution. And this is the spot in the green, the little yard in the middle of the Tower of London, which is actually a whole complex. This is the spot where Anne was executed, and they have a plaque underneath, surrounded by a little fence, and it's really rather moving. Anne dies to serve the desires of Henry, who is now really becoming less and less of an attractive personality and more of a murderous despot. So exit Anne. Catherine, just by the way, is not dead. Catherine was, when the annulment was granted by Henry and all his power invested in him by him, Catherine and Mary were sent off to that dismal castle where they're essentially living in exile in England. Henry then marries Jane Seymour. And Jane is lucky, I guess, in that she manages to die before Henry gets tired of her. She gets pregnant, she has a child, the child is a boy, and the child survives. The child is Edward, more about him later. Unfortunately, Jane gets an infection as a result of the birth, again, not too uncommon in the time, and so she dies shortly after the infant Edward is dead. Henry is devastated. Again, he had not grown tired of Jane yet, and he, the fact that she gave him the heir that he so desperately wanted just makes her that much more appealing in his memory. And for the rest of his life, he would always say that Jane was the true love of his life. And when he finally dies, he directs that he should be buried with Jane. So I suppose in some weird way there was actual affection and even love there. So exit wife number 3, Jane. Anne of Cleves is the next contestant brought in as a purely political marriage. She was a princess from Northern Europe, from one of the duchies called Cleves. Famously, Henry feels that he was tricked into marrying Anne. It was a political thing. Henry was told that she was young, she was beautiful. He was given a portrait of her. When she arrives for the marriage, it turns out she's not that beautiful, she's not that attractive, she's not that charming. Henry blames his advisors for this and divorces Anne as quickly as he can. She lives out the rest of her life in very comfortable exile as a former Queen of England, actually does pretty well as wives of Henry VIII go. The next wife is Katherine Howard. Katherine Howard actually does cheat on Henry. By this time, Henry is becoming morbidly obese. He's suffering from a long-term infection that he got from a wound in his leg. He's a very unappealing personality. Catherine, he marries him. Does have a series of actual affairs, is found out, is tried, and is executed. Bringing us to wife number 6, Katherine Parr. Catherine marries Henry when he's quite old. She's less of a wife and more of a nurse, actually. She takes care of him in his old age up until his death, and apparently does a fine job of it. And so she managed to survive Henry. So those are the 6 wives of Henry VIII. The way to remember them is the little bit of doggerel. Divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. Right, so Catherine divorced, Anne beheaded, Jane survived. Jane dies in childbirth, then divorced, Anne of Cleves, beheaded, and then number 6, Catherine VI survives. Katherine Parr survives. Okay, so much for the wives. Edward is the longed-for heir, the son of Henry and Jane. This is him as the world's most regal baby. And he is groomed to be the King of England literally from birth. Henry, this is Henry in all of his late Renaissance codpiece glory. When Henry finally dies as a morbidly obese, blood-poisoned, loathed curmudgeon, he is succeeded by Edward VI, young Edward, who takes the throne as a teenager. It doesn't go well for him. He does not reign. He only reigns for 6 years. He was always a sickly kid and dies rather predictably after 6 years on the throne. Edward inherits the religious problems that were created by his father. When Henry creates the Church of England, the Anglican Church, and then begins to tinker with it, he had really split England asunder. There were many Englishmen who liked the ideas of the Reformation, who were drawn to the ideas of Protestantism for the same reason that people in Europe were drawn to it. But there are many Englishmen who were still good and loyal Catholics who never saw the attraction of Protestantism, and the fact that Henry had made England Protestant for the rather base reason of marrying Anne Boleyn just made it that much less appealing. So England is by the time we get to the middle of the 16th century, England is religiously divided, intensely religiously divided. Edward VI is a true believing Protestant. He's been raised as a member of the Church of England, as a Protestant monarch. And he wants to advance the cause of the Protestant Church of England. He wants to make the church more Protestant and less like the Roman Catholic Church. And so he pursues that for a while until his early and untimely death. All right, Edward's dead. There's only two kids left of Henry VIII. They're both women, and the elder one, and therefore the one with priority, is Mary. Mary, remember, the daughter of poor Catherine of Aragon. Mary, who was sent off into exile with her Spanish mother. Mary, who has been raised by her mother to be a very devout Catholic and to hate the idea of the Church of England because it was the Church of England that made her mother an exile and made Mary technically a bastard, because when the marriage was annulled, that meant that Mary was the product of something that was not marriage. So Mary was rendered a bastard by this, a very great slight. Mary, however, is next in line. And so in 1553, she becomes the Queen of England. Mary does not have a happy life. But as a queen, she is an attractive political marriage, and she marries Philip II of Spain and the Holy Roman Empire, a man of extraordinary power and importance, and she is infatuated with him. I mean, Mary, but Mary probably never even had a boyfriend, never mind any kind of actual lover before she meets Philip when they are betrothed. She's quite infatuated with him. She has a crush on him. And Philip, he regards her with contempt. He's a very cultured, sophisticated man. He's the king of Spain. He's the Holy Roman Emperor. He's known the most intelligent and sophisticated people in the world. He regards Mary as this sort of English cow. She has no charm. She has no beauty. She has no wit. And even though she's totally infatuated with him, it's a very unappealing marriage. And he spends as little time with her as possible, and does nothing to provide her with emotional support. Mary, despite the problems or the emotional wreckage of her life, is a very devout Catholic, and she begins to initiate an attempt to roll back the Anglican Church, to undo everything her father and brother did, and to return England to its natural, from her perspective, Catholic faith. This is where she gets her nickname Bloody Mary. Her persecutions of English Protestants are notorious. Hundreds of people are burned alive. Many more are tortured. And she is going to attempt to force England back to Catholicism. But by the time Mary is doing this, there's a whole generation of people who have been raised up under in a Protestant England and view Protestantism as the natural state for England. And so while her persecutions are bloody and feared, they do not destroy the Protestant faith. But maybe if she had more time, they would have, but they don't. Mary gets cancer and dies. And thus, the last surviving child of Henry VIII, Elizabeth, comes to the throne. Elizabeth who has had a very dicey young adulthood, Elizabeth, who on several occasions was probably close to being executed by Mary as a great threat to her. Elizabeth, who is a Protestant, who was raised by first her mother Anne Boleyn and then by the king's subsequent wives. Elizabeth was a sincere Protestant, and now she comes to the throne. And my personal bias and my crush notwithstanding, she really is one of the remarkable women of history. When she takes control of England, it is a country split and torn apart by religious schism. It is a country that is essentially bankrupt, given all of the wealth that her father Henry had splurged away. It is a country that has enemies throughout Europe. It is a country in dire trouble. And when she leaves England, when she leaves the throne after a reign of some 45 years, England is on a trajectory which will make it, an upward trajectory that will make it the most powerful nation on earth. We will not do the entire story of Elizabeth here. Perhaps we will be able to cover it more later. Suffice it to say that she is an example of what we call a politique. A politique is sort of a version of a new monarch. It is a monarch who believes that the political needs of the state are more important than the religious needs. She is a Protestant, but she is not interested in persecuting Catholics per se. She will certainly come down and punish Catholics, but she will do so in the service of consolidating power and bringing stability to the state, rather than because they are Catholics per se. She is confronted by multiple Catholic plots to bring her down. There are several attempts to assassinate her and to overthrow her and to replace her with Catholic monarchs. And her response to those are usually rather bloody. But famously, she says, "I do not seek to make windows into men's souls," by which she meant, I don't really care what you believe. I only care about what you do in public. In other words, if her subjects were willing to go through the motions of obedience and worship at the Church of England, if they were actually in their heart of hearts Catholics, or if they made Catholic practices in their privacy of their homes, she wasn't going to go looking for them. This is not full-blown American First Amendment tolerance, but by the standards of its day, it's rather remarkable. She tries to follow the example of her grandfather, Henry VII. She tries to avoid war as long as she can because war is expensive and she doesn't have a lot of money. She does, however, send out many privateers, or you would call them pirates, to try and obtain money from the Spanish treasure fleets that are coming out of the New World. And her pirates, most famously Sir Walter Raleigh, were very successful. And so although she's trying to avoid war with Spain, she's constantly poking them in the eye and stealing their stuff and enraging them. Philip II tried very hard to marry her. He had married her older sister. That didn't work out, but he was willing, he was game, he would have married Elizabeth. Elizabeth knows that as soon as she marries anybody, she loses maneuverability, she loses her own authority to whoever her husband was. So she never said she wouldn't marry, and in fact several times she said she was going to get married, but she never somehow got around to it, never got around to picking somebody who she would actually marry, which leaves her with the authority and the sovereignty over England. Philip finally gets sick of the of the prevarication and the stalling. He realizes that Elizabeth is never going to marry him, never going to marry a Spaniard, and she keeps stealing his stuff. And by the way, she's a heretic. And so he decides he is going to crush this puny island nation. Spain is the world's superpower at this point, wealthy beyond all compare with England, and he sends a massive fleet of ships to invade in England, to crush English forces, to depose Elizabeth and replace her with a Catholic monarch. It fails. The Armada, everyone in the beginning expects the Armada to triumph because Spain is so much stronger. It fails partly because of the weather. When the Spanish fleet sails into the English Channel to the south of England, between England and France, the wind is against it. The English fleet, commanded by Sir Walter Raleigh, the pirate, is better adapted for the weather and the wind. It is commanded with courage and elan, if somewhat greedily. And the Armada is defeated in a series of engagements in the English Channel. There's a famous instance which tells you a lot about Raleigh's character. Raleigh is the admiral of the fleet, and he was everyone knew the fleet was coming. They were waiting. The watch ships were out looking for the Spaniards, and finally the word comes to Raleigh that the Spanish have been sighted and they're pulling into the channel. And Raleigh, who was playing a game of bowl, which is kind of like bocce on the lawn, asks where they were and says, "Well, I have time to finish my game first," which is the kind of super cool thing that Raleigh would be able to pull off. But then when the battle actually starts and the Spanish ships are engaged and the English ships are winning, a very large and wealthy Spanish ship is all shut up and begins to pull away. It's trying to withdraw from the fight, which is, after all, the point of sea battle, to drive your enemy away. And Raleigh abandons the battle to go and chase this Spanish ship because it's going to be a rich prize and will make him money. Once a pirate, always a pirate, I guess. But the Armada is defeated. This map of the time shows how the Spanish fleet, the Armada, sails into the Channel, is terribly defeated, shattered, and they can't even turn around and go back down the Channel to escape. The wind is against them, and the English are there. So they had to try and escape by sailing all the way around Great Britain, up to the north, up around Scotland, up around Ireland, and then back. And it's just savaged by the weather. It's savaged by the pursuing English fleet. And the Armada limps back into Spain, completely destroyed, completely humiliated. It is an extraordinary victory for Elizabeth. It proves her strength and her blessedness, and it confirms her as one of the all-time heroes of British history. A quick aside on the story of Mary Stuart, or Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary is Elizabeth's rival. Her story is fascinating and deep, but we won't go into it in detail. She is a Scottish queen. She is the daughter of the Queen of Scotland. She marries the Prince of France, and was very briefly the Queen of France. Unfortunately, her husband, dies after less than a year of being the king, which leaves her a widow of no particular power. She is sent back to Scotland. She tries to assert her authority in Scotland, has a series of very romantic and exciting adventures, during one of which her second husband, who is estranged from her, his house explodes, and he is found murdered in his own garden. She then marries the man who was probably responsible for murdering her second husband. It's all very colorful. She is not able ultimately to assert authority over Scotland. She has a son named James, who she is forced to give up. James, who is
the heir to the throne of Scotland, is taken from his mother when he's 10 months old, because he's a political bargaining chip. Mary is forced to flee to the south, to England, to her cousin Elizabeth, to seek help. And Elizabeth, you can say this is either very clever or very, very nasty and bitchy. Elizabeth does not help her. Rather, Elizabeth throws Mary Stuart into captivity. And Mary will spend years, almost decades, in very nice castles, but she's a prisoner. Elizabeth cannot send her back to Scotland because that would cause trouble with the border. She wants to have good relations with Scotland. She doesn't want a war there. But she can't release Mary either because Mary has a legitimate claim to the throne of England. They're related. She's Elizabeth's cousin, and Mary is Catholic. So all the Catholic English who want to get rid of Elizabeth see Mary as the great hope. For years, Elizabeth's advisors try and persuade her to execute Mary. Elizabeth resists and resists and resists and say, I will not kill my own blood. Mary has done nothing wrong. Finally, Elizabeth is persuaded that Mary has participated in a plot. Evidence is given to Elizabeth that Mary took part in a plan to overthrow Elizabeth, to murder her, and to make Mary the new Catholic Queen of England. There's a pretty good chance that the evidence of Mary's involvement was forged. There was a plot. There were several plots against Elizabeth. Whether Mary actually took part in this particular plot, whether she knew about it, is pretty dicey. But Elizabeth is persuaded, or allows herself to be persuaded, that Mary was involved with this, and Elizabeth signs the death warrant. And so Mary, after her very colorful, very sad life, is executed for her part in this plot. But I suppose you could say in the long run, Mary has her revenge, because it is her son, James, who will succeed Elizabeth. Elizabeth never names a successor. She never marries. She never has children. And this would be a huge problem. This is the same problem that her father, Henry VIII, had. No heir means instability and the possibility of horrific civil war. But Elizabeth reigns for so long, years after years, decade after decade, that people sort of get used to it. It's not that they aren't concerned, but it seems so very far away. When she dies, the obvious candidate to succeed her is Mary Queen of Scots, Mary Stuart's son, the young James I. James, who you remember, was the little boy who was taken away from his mother and has been raised as a Protestant king of Scotland. He is, when Elizabeth is getting near death, he is James VI of Scotland. Elizabeth, who never was willing to name a successor, because once you name a successor, then obviously people start paying attention to the successor and not to her. Elizabeth, supposedly on her deathbed, says that James will be her successor. It's possible that they just made that up and she never said it. Probably she did. James is then quickly hustled down from Scotland, where he is crowned James the First. And so the Tudor dynasty lasts for less than a century. Henry VII, Henry VIII, Edward IV, Mary, and then Elizabeth. James the Stuart becomes the first Stuart king of England, and the Stuarts will have a story, if anything, even more remarkable and bizarre than that of the Tudors, but that is a story for the 17th century. Thanks for listening.